The Stone Cold Podcast with AJ Styles that was announced a few weeks ago by WWE. Couldn't have been any more psyched for it. Every Stone Cold podcast, even the Mick Foley one, even the Chris Jericho ones, every single one has had something to offer. Not everyone has been great. Not everyone has been super newsworthy. Some have been more fun than they were engaging or compelling or, like I said, newsworthy or groundbreaking or whatever. But pretty much everyone, in my opinion, I believe 12 have been held at this point. I know I did an article a few months ago counting down or ranking every podcast that has been held to date. And I think that might have been back in January before or after the Ric Flair one, or after the Shawn Michaels one. But since then, we've had the Big Show, we've had Shane McMahon, we might have had somebody else. But I believe we've only had Big Show, Shane, and now AJ Styles. Out of all of them, and I just rewatched the Brock Lesnar one about a month ago or a few weeks ago, and it was really, really good. Love the Brock Lesnar one. That one probably is still my favorite. But even if not, I don't know if this one will surpass this. The AJ Styles one from last night I thought was exceptional. Not even a full hour. I mean, they put it on right after Raw, which was around like 11:05, 11:10, whatever. And they went off the air around 12. So I believe I got to check the time on it. I haven't gone back and listened to it or checked the time or the clock or whatever. That or the timestamp. I don't even think the conversation lasted a full hour, which is fine. But it's just funny that every other podcast they've ever had has gone at least an hour, if not more. I mean, with a lot of people like Shane, Vince, obviously, he runs the place, he can do what he wants. They've gone overtime. A lot of these guys have done an hour and a half, I've seen. But anyway, I thought this was good. I thought this was really, really good. Obviously, AJ Styles, my current favorite WWE superstar. He's been a favorite of mine since his days in TNA many years ago. So I was excited to see him in this platform. We rarely hear AJ Styles do interviews and podcasts and stuff like that. He was on Jericho's podcast a few times. He was on JR's podcast about a month or two or a year or two ago. And he's always done really well in that environment. And this podcast was no exception. He talked obviously early on about his upbringing, being a sport guy, how it worked out with his girlfriend in high school and later wife, and how he had kids and how they're kind of the center of his world, all that kind of thing. Before getting into the uncharted territories, which I'll talk about in a second. I'll talk about in a second in terms of WWE acknowledging it. Excuse me, but then they get into the infamous three letters that are typically banned on WWE TV for whatever reason. In 2016, I honestly don't think it matters anymore. We've seen so many unprecedented things happen this year that, not that it wouldn't shock me, but I just feel like it's a matter of time before they finally acknowledge TNA on WWE TV. I just don't see why not. I mean, I could see why they might be embarrassed to call them a wrestling company. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest, but they still, not that they're a competition in any way, I just feel like that they're so insignificant of a threat at this point, and maybe that's why they didn't acknowledge them many years ago, unlike they've done with WCW and ECW and even Ring of Honor. They know Ring of Honor is no threat to them. They even worked with them at some points, and trading talent and, and acknowledging them and working on pieces for the website. So I just don't understand, especially in the state that TNA is in. I think Ring of Honor was a bigger threat to WWE than TNA is at this point. So I just don't understand why they don't bring it up. Like a perfect example, I'm not saying they need to shove TNA down their throat every single week, but I'm saying in any instance where it's necessary, like where John Cena was bringing up the companies that AJ Styles had made famous, PWG, New Japan Pro Wrestling, that he was most known for, rather, and Ring of Honor, no mention of TNA. Again, not surprising, but it's just why. In 2016, where TNA is nearly on the verge of death, I hate to say it, I enjoy the product, but it pretty much is, I just don't see why they can't talk about it. Now, that said, on the podcast, it's a totally different story. I just remember when Stone Cold brought up TNA on the Vince podcast, the very first one they did back in December of 2014. They haven't mentioned TNA since. I don't know why they would. I mean, what are they going to ask Mick Foley about TNA? Or rather, they're going to talk to... Or they've had the Mick Foley podcast, too. I forgot about that one right before WrestleMania. That was good, too. Were they going to talk to Shane about TNA? I mean, they really haven't had any guests where they could talk about TNA for the most part. Maybe Christian, but even that, he was with Edge, so they weren't really going to talk about his TNA run. But anyway, though, it was obviously, they needed to talk about it last night with AJ Styles. The guy wrestled there for freaking 11 years, so they would have been just asinine had they gone a full hour talking about his entire wrestling career and not talking about the one promotion that he helped make famous, for the most part, was that he represented for over a decade, in that being TNA Impact Wrestling. And they went really in depth with it, too. I mean, they kind of avoided it for a while. They waited to talk. They didn't even mention the TNA initials until, like, halfway through the podcast, until, like, 11:30. I'm checking my clock, like, okay, when are they talking about this thing? I mean, the first half of the podcast was really good, but I was waiting for them to get into the TNA stuff. And they finally did it halfway through, and when they opened it, and it's funny too, the way they mentioned it, it's almost sounded like they were talking about like Chris Benoit or something. Like they're like, so you work for TNA. Like the way that he said it, it sounded like he was almost trying to hide the fact, or he wasn't trying to like let Vince hear, like, what are you saying? Not that was the case, but it just came across that way in the way that he said it, in the way that he said it very softly. AJ Styles did the same thing when he talked about Christopher Daniels and name dropped him. He said his name really fast. I know that's just the way that AJ talks. But he name dropped his name really, really fast, Christopher Daniels, and he kind of sped over what he was going to be talking about in regards to Daniels. But then later on, he kind of got more comfortable and he settled in and he talked a lot more about TNA. He got like 5 mentions of TNA in like a 2-minute video, which WWE put on their YouTube channel right after the podcast went off the air. They had this clip on the WWE YouTube channel, which is not uncommon. They've done this before, where they'll take a snippet of any any interview from the Stone Cold podcast just to drive viewers, obviously drive traffic to the WWE network. But I go on YouTube after watching the podcast, which I'll talk more about in depth in a second. But I go on YouTube, I go into my subscriptions feed, I see that little video, and the title of the video says AJ Styles talks about where he made his name, or like post WCW. And the title of the video didn't say TNA. The description of the video didn't say TNA. It probably was in like the tags or something if someone searched it up on YouTube, but it wasn't in the description box. It wasn't in the title of the video itself. But I'm thinking, okay, so maybe this is talking about his WCW days or something. And I already listened to the podcast, but I was interested to see what snippet from the podcast they put up on the YouTube channel. And literally in the first 2 or 3 seconds of the clip, it said, so let's talk about TNA. I'm like, oh shit, the full 2-minute video they put up on their own YouTube channel was about TNA. And it was really, really surprising. And again, they probably just did that, not they're going to start mentioning TNA by name going forward. But I imagine that they just did that to get people talking, like I'm doing right now. I got a lot of oohs and ahs on Twitter and social media last night, people saying like they're actually talking about TNA, like this is mind-blowing. They name dropped Dixie Carter, and they name dropped Hulk Hogan, which of course, it's still a taboo, topic considering the fact that, he was, accused for being a racist about a year ago and he hasn't been in the company since, but he has been name dropped here and there. Talking about him coming into TNA, which was fascinating. So I figured he would just be talking about how he made his name there, and he did, but he also went into discussion about, and Stone Cold, always the excellent interviewer, talking about or bringing up the tough questions, not, hammering AJ, but bringing up the questions that we all wanted to know. And in some cases, I already knew the answer to, because like I said, AJ's been on JR's podcast before. He's been on YTJ's podcast before, twice actually, one before he came to WWE, one after. So I've kind of heard this same thing before, but it was just fascinating to me to hear him talking about it in such a setting on a WWE network, with Stone Cold Steve Austin asking those questions. You know what I mean? And AJ just comes off so likable and so humble as it is, and so genuinely nice. So it was really cool to see him give these, really heartfelt answers about how he felt, about the way he's been booked so far. And not saying they booked him horribly, but rather saying that I will be making the most of every opportunity they put me in. Give me the opportunity, I will make the most of it. And my job here is to help, get myself over and really just, to do what I've been doing. I'm the phenomenal one. I do things, I do innovative things, blah, blah, blah. You got to listen to the whole podcast. I'm not doing it justice. But you know what I'm saying, though. And that for the final, overall, I thought it was really, really good. He came across great. But just for that one, segment of the TNA talk was just fascinating. Like I said, talking about his upbringing there, talking about Samoa Joe, Kurt Angle coming in, Hulk Hogan coming in, Dixie Carter trying to re-sign him, and him just taking a pay cut. He just outright said, I didn't really feel like I deserved to take the pay cut that I did, having never done a bad thing for the company, always having been their number one supporter. And they decided that I wanted to take a pay cut. I said no, and then I left. And that's pretty much what he said in explaining his departure from TNA. So then he went on to say that he also mentioned, he didn't go into full-on details, and I didn't think he would. And I think some people were hoping they would, or they would talk about it. It was honestly the last thing on my mind until he mentioned this, about how he almost tried to resign with TNA, in Ring of Honor and New Japan as well, before coming to WWE. And AJ explained that Triple H he had a friend reach out to Triple H. The friend remained anonymous. It might have been Samoa Joe. I'm not exactly sure who it would have been, but maybe it was a friend in talent relations or something like that. So he said he had a friend reach out to Triple H about coming into WWE, and he never heard back from Triple H. So he started negotiating with TNA and Ring of Honor and New Japan, And he just wanted to be with his family. And obviously he couldn't do that if he was living over in Japan. So that's why he wanted to possibly come back to TNA. And then Triple H finally reached out 2 weeks later, had a 30-minute conversation with AJ. The first time they'd ever talked, AJ said. And he knew right after he got off the phone with him that that was the place where he wanted and, more importantly, needed to be. So he made the deal to come to WWE, but he didn't talk about, obviously, this is what the part that I'm talking about here. He didn't say anything about how TNA put out a statement right before he came to WWE about him stiffing their deal and blah, 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 and then being bitter over the whole thing. I thought it'd be funny if he did mention that. He didn't. He was a professional, and I respect that. But, and again, I don't know if anyone's disappointed he didn't talk about that. I didn't really expect him to at all. That's not really anything for a WWE podcast. It's just interesting information. Because the topic, what they were talking about, the focus of what they were talking about was how he came to WWE, how the deal came about, talked about his debut, wrestling at WrestleMania, all this other stuff, feuding with John Cena. So again, great podcast. The hour flew by. It wasn't even an hour long, I don't think. Like I don't even think it was an hour long, I don't think. I think it might have been just like 50, 55 minutes. The audio will be up on Stone Cold's podcast. If you don't have the network, which you should by now, but if you don't, the audio will be up on Stone Cold's podcast. I don't think this week. I just got finished listening to it. He has Vince Russo on today on his family-friendly show, and then on Thursday he's got Goldberg, which should also be pretty good. So I imagine it's going to be dropping next Tuesday, so I'm looking forward to that. But I've already listened to it, but hopefully I'll be listening to it again because I thought it was just so great. So if you haven't heard it, if you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. Very stimulating, engaging, and compelling conversation between Stone Cold Steve Austin and AJ Styles. Another 2 thumbs up to Stone Cold for another amazing podcast. I look forward to seeing who he has on next. He didn't mention that he will have someone on. He will be back for the podcast in another month or two. He said he has no idea who he's going to be talking to. But hopefully it's another equally big name. I would love to see, Seth Rollins on the podcast. Even Roman Reigns or Dean Ambrose. I know they really have no groundbreaking or any dirt on any of their company like AJ might have had with TNA. But it'd still be here to hear either of them on the podcast. We do not typically hear Roman Reigns do podcasts and stuff like that, a tell-all podcast. So I'd be interested to hear, or even Sting, who went into the Hall of Fame this year, or The Undertaker, which has to happen at some point. Hopefully sooner rather than later. I don't know if they're going to be doing it in the next few months. I doubt it. I don't know. I don't see the reason why, other than it'd be great, but I don't see why the timing would work out that way. Anyway, though, he will be back in another month or two, he said, to interview someone else for the WWE Network, and I look forward to seeing who he talks to, because every Stone Cold podcast thus far, including the Jericho and Foley ones, have been very, very good.